G'day, Rich Hungerford here from Bushore, Australia Survival and Tracking School. A lot of my survival courses start with a discussion. That discussion is about the semantic difference between primitive technology and anthropology versus survival reality. There's a lot of skill sets, I guess, and crafts, and I'd almost call them hobbies, but I'm not in a disparaging way, that are on the cusp. So there's correlation, for example, between flint knapping as a skill set and making an expedient cutting tool to either proceed to butcher an animal or make cordage in order to make a shelter, or to cut through some board to make it into a fire lighting kit with friction methods. So there's certainly some correlation between ancient skill sets, primal skill sets, and primitive technology that human beings the world over have employed, and survival. The trouble is, so many people get so wrapped up in flint knapping the arrowhead to attach to their longbow that they've hewed out of a piece of timber or a young sapling, they forget that that is not survival. Survival is about addressing your basic life support requirements. Shelter, water, food, and to some extent, and situation-dependent requirements, fire. There are other aspects of survival, clearly. However, the three things we cannot live without as a human being are shelter, because we are just not built to be subjected to extremes of hot or cold in the natural environment. That's why we modify the environment to produce items that protect us in that way. You can also use fire, obviously, to add to that level of protection and to provide warmth. Water, in nearly any environment you can imagine, is obviously a high priority as well. And usually it's shelter and water. In most of my experience, both tangibly and in teaching, I've always had to deal with those two things as the upper priorities first and foremost, before getting into things like food. We have time with food, but we cannot live without it indefinitely. So those things are survival. Now the crossover is this. In some areas, primitive technology and knowledge of it, or proficiency with it, can assist us to achieve some of those survival priorities. But a lot of the time people fail to understand the wider picture of where it all fits in. For example, if I do not know how to boil water to make it safe from pathogens that would otherwise compromise my immune system, but I can make a fire and can make a shelter, but I don't have any way of doing that. So traditionally we may have used something like rock boiling. To boil water, we may have had some coarse filtration processes to use with natural vegetation, sediment filters of that nature, but again they require a container. So a container is one of those things that is very, very difficult to construct from natural materials. Not impossible. There are plenty of natural containers in ecosystems the world over. However, the crossover is being able to understand that that is a survival priority and I need to invest my time in doing that, not something that's further down the food chain, so to speak, in terms of, okay, I'm going to learn to flint knap because that's a cool survival trick. Flint knapping's got next to nothing to do with survival. I can make a cutting tool just by bashing that rock together. So when you're thinking about what's a primitive technology, what's a primitive skill, keep it in the context of its anthropological roots and make sure you don't cross over the line and convince yourself that you're a survival expert when you're actually an anthropologist. And that, to me, is a clear line you must never cross. Drag information across into the survival space by all means, but be very, very careful not to convince yourself you can do things that you actually can't do.